Hello again, everyone. I wanted to talk to you today about two more hedonists. We've already looked at Epicurus, and today I wanted to talk to you about John Stuart Mill and Robert Nozick. Mill is a English philosopher, lived in the 19th century, and he wrote Utilitarianism in 1861, following On Liberty in 1859. We'll be talking about On Liberty later in the course, but both of these philosophers, Nozick and Mill, are hedonists. And we've already looked at Epicurus, who's a different kind of hedonist, because he's not recommending, just because the word hedonism means the pursuit of pleasure, he's not recommending a reckless pursuit of a life spent to eat, drink, and be merry. It's more like the pleasures of philosophy and prudence and making the right choices and limiting your physical intake, your food intake, for example. So it's a more of a life of moderation that he recommends. And so let's start with John Stuart Mill. Mill, in one famous passage to start, says that Socrates lived this exemplary life, and says, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So there you get an idea that he's not just talking about base animal tactile pleasures. He's talking about pleasures of the mind. And what he means is that Socrates, even if he doesn't get answers to his questions, and he often did not, the activity of philosophy is such that by its nature it's a higher sort of activity than the activity of eating and drinking and just a bodily activity. So better to be Socrates dissatisfied than the fool satisfied. And his little test there is that you can only ask someone who's had the intellectual pleasures, or the higher pleasures as he calls them, higher meaning mental, and the bodily pleasures, he calls the lower pleasures the beastly pleasures. If you ask someone who's had both, they'll tell you that the mental pleasures are superior. So the fool's word is not worthwhile then, because he has not enjoyed both kinds of pleasure. That is what makes him a fool. He pursues the animal pleasures non-stop. So Mill is in Utilitarianism is recommending there, this is developed from the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, who preceded him and wrote the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Mill thought that that doctrine needed modification. But a good action, according to Utilitarianism, this much has stayed the same from Bentham to Mill, the space of some 75 years between them. A good action is still one that promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That's the locution you see the most. A good action creates the greatest amount of happiness for the most. And sometimes that word happiness is used as pleasure. Mill thinks he needs to modify what Bentham wrote, however, and Mill writes this 100-page essay known as Utilitarianism, as I said, in 1861. And what he says there is that we shouldn't just concentrate on the quantity of pleasure, and he accuses Bentham of having done just that. It's not just the most amount of happiness, but we have to make a distinction between the qualities of pleasures, hence leading to that famous line that I just described to you, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than the fool satisfied. So Mill is recommending some pleasures in and of themselves. Some people think this is not true utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham had said, if you prefer pushpin to poetry, then that's all the same. Pushpin is a child's game where you push pins across the table, and if that gives you more pleasure, then so be it. It may be more pleasurable to you than poetry. Mill would not have said that. Mill thinks that there are these qualitative pleasures and there are these lower pleasures. He gives examples of pleasures that are worthwhile in themselves, regardless of what they produce in us. So virtue, anything that would produce a virtuous action, we'll get to Aristotle before long, but Aristotle had a number of virtues such as self-control, courage, generosity, liberality, these things, and there's the right amount, what he calls the mean, between two extremes. That's getting too far into his doctrine. But what Mill is saying here is that these are worthwhile, even if they, in and of themselves, even if they don't produce good activity from the person, they're just intrinsically worthwhile. So those are examples of higher pleasures, living a virtuous life, and not the pursuit of lower pleasure. So Mill has had, like Epicurus, and like Nozick to a degree, when we come around to it, is of this belief that it's not just any pleasure that can be recommended. It has to be a certain kind of pleasure, a mental pleasure that is the greatest. You remember Epicurus saying that what we want is health in the body and freedom from disturbance in the soul. And the best way to have that is to have this trait called prudence, which is a kind of wisdom that enables us to see what pleasures are worth pursuing and which are not. Without that, we can really make a mess of life and choose the wrong pleasures. Let's get to Robert Nozick. Nozick is a philosopher from Harvard, wrote an award-winning book in the early 1970s called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. In that book he has a little thought experiment, and the thought experiment happens to be with this experience machine, which you now well know. The experience machine, just to say a word about it, will duplicate any activity you want, right down to the most particular kind of sensation. So, for example, if you wanted to crawl inside the mind of some genius, like Isaac Newton or Galileo or Shakespeare or Einstein, and know exactly what they were thinking, you could hook yourself up to this machine and lower yourself into this vat and have all the sensations that they had. And now Nozick is of the mind that even if this was offered to you, you wouldn't take it. That the experience machine is not what we want. We really want, as he says, to be a certain way and do certain things, and make a connection with reality, not some simulation, tank like a experience machine. So that's his notion. So there you notice too, he's not just saying that, he's not siding with sensual pleasures, similar to Epicurus, similar to Mill. Even if he could have these sensual pleasures non-stop by hooking up into this machine, you would not take them, he thinks. The way he set it up is that you would have to hook yourself up for 2 years at a time. So it wouldn't be 10 minutes or an hour or a couple of hours. And then you would have some time off, and then you could decide what next kinds of pleasures you would want. It's not so clear you wouldn't do that. For one, you might take a part of your education, which if you go to 12 years before college and then 4 years of college, then you go in for a graduate degree, you could be in school for 20 plus years. With that in mind, would you take some of that time out to get into this experience machine, if you're a science major, to think like Galileo did or Einstein did? If you're a writer, would you want to be inside the mind of Shakespeare, to know what he was thinking when he was writing his poems and plays? A lot of time is spent in education anyway. What would it hurt? So I'm not so clear that the answer is no, I wouldn't go into the machine automatically. That doesn't mean you'd want a whole lifetime of that. In addition, there are some things, I'm going to give you two categories. There are things we can't do and we might be afraid to do that we could do safely in the experience machine. And then I'll end the talk there. But the things we can't do is we can't get into the mind of a Shakespeare so easily because it's past. We can't do it in this life, but we can do it in the experience machine. I can know exactly what he was thinking when he was writing the tragedies, comedies, and histories, and this may be a spur to my own creativity. Then there are things you're afraid to do. You might be afraid to try bungee jumping or skydiving, and so the experience machine could give you a simulation of those things without risk. In fact, there are these simulation tanks around that simulate skydiving. I see them as I drive along sometimes here. But so if you're afraid to do those things but would like the sensation of doing them, there you would have it. Also, haven't we done experience machines before? You go into a dark theater, the lights go down, and just the stage is lit, and this is some simulation of 19th century England, or this is some a chorus line, or it's a simulation of a jungle, or whatever the case may be. So simulation machines are not foreign to us. But in any case, Nozick is of the idea that you wouldn't want this for life, and he may in fact be right. You want to, as he puts it, be a certain way, do certain things, and have a connection to reality. So we want more than mere pleasure seeking in this life. So those three thinkers are not so far apart. Epicurus, Mill, and Nozick are rather kindred spirits in this respect. All right, so that's all I wanted to say today about John Stuart Mill and Robert Nozick. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll talk more about them in the days to come. See you next time.